Hi everyone, welcome to The Week in Doubt, episode 39, Is Religion the Problem? Today's episode is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at www.audibletrial.com/theweekindoubt. Over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Before we get started, I'd like to apologize for any technical glitches that may have plagued last week's episode. You may have heard some random electronic popping noises, some chair squeaks, not to mention the high-pitched barking of my chihuahua here and there. Once again, my apologies, and here's hoping that today's show goes a bit more smoothly. I'd also like to apologize if I sounded a bit too glib or condescending in last week's episode. I repeatedly scoffed at creationism or intelligent design without giving a detailed explanation of what it is about them that I specifically take issue with. The reason why I didn't get into the topic of creationism more deeply last week is because I didn't want to wander too far from last week's theme, which was the Mojave Memorial Cross. If you want to hear a more thoughtful take from me on the subject of creationism, you can go back through the archives and look for episode 9, simply entitled Creationism. I give a brief history of creationism stretching from the time of the early church all the way up to the wacky world of Ken Ham's Creation Museum. So you can check that out if you like, and I'm sure someday down the road I'll revisit the topic again. Oh, there's one more thing I'd like to address before we start. I received a strangely terse comment this week in response to one of the YouTube episodes. I believe it was in response to the Mojave Memorial Cross episode. It was a brief message. The person simply wrote, "You're kind of New Yorkie, aren't you?" Stranger still, I believe the person was an atheist, at least judging by their uploads and subscriptions. You'd think they might want to extend a hand in solidarity to a fellow non-believer, but no, just, "You're kind of New Yorkie, aren't you?" I just good-naturedly laughed it off and let the person know I'm actually from the Boston area, not New York, but I could see how one might confuse the two accents. It's funny, I consciously try to speak properly and round off my R's, but I can tell when I let my guard down, the old New England accent has a way of creeping back up. But what's it matter? So I have an accent, we're all from somewhere, right? Without trying to sound too corny, we should all try to practice some degree of self-acceptance, and there's no need to feel ashamed of where we come from. As you can tell, I tend to overanalyze everything. So I'll take that episode for the amusing oddity it was and let it roll off my shoulders. If they think I sound New Yorkie on the podcast, they should hear me after 4 or 5 beers. But anyway, on to today's theme. Is religion the problem? We're now almost 40 episodes in, and since the show's inception, I've been asserting that it's not my desire to wag my finger at religion or lay blame with it for the world's ills. I've always stated that first and foremost, my goal is to try to get to the truth of things, to apply reason to life's big questions. And that still holds true, but I think the question of whether or not religion is a destructive force is an important one. One of my personal intellectual heroes, the late Christopher Hitchens, famously wrote a book entitled God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. 2 other men I greatly admire, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, are also known for their strong stance against what some perceive as the corrupting influence of religion. But does religion really poison everything? Does it have any redeeming value? And what of atheism? Can it, as some Christian apologists like to argue, also be a destructive or corrupting force? These are all questions I hope to shed some light on. I suppose what I should do is start with a kind of obvious laundry list of negative acts associated with religion. Then afterwards, I can tackle what redeeming qualities religion may have to offer the world. If we look back into antiquity, I think one of the oldest and most obvious troubling acts associated with religion is the practice of human sacrifice. I admittedly have a soft spot for pagan religions, and I tend to romanticize them. But in the spirit of honesty, many of them did practice ritual human sacrifice. From the ancient Celts to some of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, such as the Mayans and the Aztecs. There were a couple of different types of human sacrifice. On the one hand, you had the sacrifice of a victim, willing or unwilling, in an attempt to appease the gods or a specific god. And then in some instances, you had what's known as retainer sacrifice. And that's when a person of prominence or importance, a monarch in some cases perhaps, passes away and their wives, servants, or concubines are killed and either burned or interred with them so they can continue to serve them in the afterlife. From what I've read, it appears that human sacrifice developed alongside animal sacrifice. The reason why I'm not listing animal sacrifice as one of the negative acts associated with religion is because, surprisingly, despite the deep reverence and affection I have for animals, I actually think there is a positive aspect to animal sacrifice. Animals were considered extremely valuable, and it's not the case that they were sacrificed and then cast aside. Usually the gods were thought to take their allotted portion in the form of smoke wafting up to heaven or in spilled blood seeping into the altar or the earth, and the remains were consumed by the human participants or the community. So at least the animal's death wasn't in vain, or its remains weren't going to waste. In a sense, you could argue that at least in a ceremonial context, the animal was treated with more reverence than the cellophane chunks of meat we buy at the supermarket. But back to the cherry subject of human sacrifice. If we move up to the Abrahamic faiths, we can find mention of human sacrifice in both the Old Testament as well as the Quran. The most notable biblical story referencing human sacrifice is the tale of the binding of Isaac, in which the biblical patriarch Abraham prepares to sacrifice his son, but has his hand stayed at the last moment by an interceding angel. The disturbing story of Jephthah is another tale of human sacrifice found in the Hebrew Bible. To celebrate his victory against Ammon, Jephthah vows to sacrifice to God the first creature that exit his door upon returning home. Unfortunately, the first creature to exit Jephthah's house upon his return is his daughter, his only child. In fairness to the adherents of the Judeo-Christian tradition, it can be argued that such stories, particularly the story of Abraham and Isaac, are morality tales denouncing rather than promoting human sacrifice. There may also be an attempt by biblical authors to draw a distinction between the ancient monotheistic Jews and their pagan neighbors who are still engaging in human sacrifice. There are other passages in the Bible that seem less like morality tales and more like recordings of divinely mandated atrocities. Christopher Hitchens used to like to mention the slaughter of the Amalekites. In the book of Samuel, chapter 15, 2-3, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on their way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek, and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So there you can see what appears to be a direct mandate from God to kill every living thing of the enemy, including even women and infants. There's a similar scenario that takes place in the book of Numbers, where Moses commands the destruction of the Midianites. Book of Numbers 31:15, "And Moses said unto them, Have you saved all the women alive?" Numbers 31:16, "Behold, these caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to commit trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor. And there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord." Numbers 31:17-18. "Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that hath known man by lying with him. But all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves." So there we see not only the God of the Bible commanding the killing of infants, but also commanding or approving of the taking of women as spoils of war. And this kind of misogynistic tone isn't an isolated occurrence. It seems to be a repeating theme throughout the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy, if within the city a man comes upon a maiden who is betrothed and has relations with her, you shall bring them both out of the gate of the city and there stone them to death. The girl because she did not cry out for help, though she was in the city, and the man because he violated his neighbor's wife. And then again in the book of Samuel, thus said the Lord, I will bring evil upon you out of your own house. I will take your wives, plural, while you live to see it, and will give them to your neighbor. He shall lie with your wives in broad daylight. You have done this deed in secret, but I will bring it about the presence of all Israel, and with the sun looking down. And then in Exodus, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are. If she does not please the man who bought her, he may allow her to be bought back again, but he is not allowed to sell her to foreigners, since he is the one who broke the contract with her. And if the slave girl's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a slave girl, but must treat her as his daughter. Well, I guess that shows some kind of mercy or compassion. Then in the book of Zechariah, lo, a day shall come for the Lord when the spoil shall be divided in your midst, and I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem for battle. The city shall be taken, houses plundered, women ravished. Half of the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be removed from the city. And then also, you're probably familiar with one of the most well-known biblical stories, the story of Lot, in which Lot takes in 2 guests who are actually disguised angels, and the depraved men of the city, as bizarre and shocking as it sounds, are banging on Lot's door demanding to have sex with the male strangers. And instead, Lot offers up his daughters. And you can find this in the book of Genesis. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them. Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, no, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. And some biblical scholars have tried to write this off as an allegory about hospitality and the lengths you're supposed to go to protect your guests and be hospitable. But those are some very odd lengths, offering up your own daughter, or daughters, I should say. It is kind of strange. I have seen a number of Christian apologists or biblical scholars try to just shrug this one off as if the people who take moral offense with the story are being too literal. But even if it's being read as an allegory, it's still a very disturbing and misogynistic allegory, I think. There's also Exodus 22:18, which, if not misogynistic, is at least violent and superstitious. And it contains the infamous injunction, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And you can see how some of these passages could be used to help justify things like slavery, the persecution of so-called witches, patriarchal or misogynistic attitudes. In fairness, though, I probably should point out that in the case of slavery, I think the Bible is kind of a double-edged sword in that that it can be, or that it was used to both justify slavery and also to denounce slavery. And I think that's what makes trying to decide whether or not it's fair to pin the blame on religion for certain ills kind of tricky. Because, as is the case with most religious texts, the Bible is kind of a double-edged sword, or a mixed bag. Both believers and critics of organized religion can engage in what's sometimes known as quote mining, kind of cherry picking certain quotes to try to prove their point. But I think, in fairness to we non believers or biblical critics, there may be some positive things in the Bible too. That doesn't mean you can ignore the plethora of barbaric, genocidal, patriarchal, misogynistic passages that are there. There may be more positive passages to kind of balance those out to some degree, you might argue, but it doesn't change the fact that those negative passages are still a part of your holy book. And how do you account for them? How do you explain them? Are you a biblical literalist who tries to justify those morally offensive and barbaric biblical passages? And I don't think that really paints a pretty picture, and I've seen that, these biblical fundamentalists or literalists who believe that all that ugly stuff in the Bible really did happen, but tough luck, God can be a harsh or wrathful God, and we're not to question him. And if you don't keep your nose clean, you're going to be in for eternal damnation. But then you might have more like cafeteria Catholics and people take a more figurative approach to the Bible. In that case, as I've talked about on the show before, if you get to pick and choose what you believe in literally in the Bible, where does it end? And what kind of yardstick are you using to decide what should be taken literally and what should be taken figuratively? If you get to kind of decide what's made up and what's not, or what's meant to be taken seriously or literally and what's not, what are you really left with? Some people go as far as basically just, hanging their hat on the resurrection and everything else. It's all right to take figuratively. But then in that case, how do you even know if the resurrection was true or that the story of the resurrection should be taken literally? It's like you're willing to take a leap of faith when it comes to the good or positive things, but you'll just try to brush the more ugly things under the carpet and say that they're meant to be taken figuratively, or that's just the outdated, barbaric Old Testament. What we're really supposed to be paying attention to is the New Testament. When, of course, Christians often have no problem embracing the Old Testament when it supports their bigoted attitudes. Say when it comes to their stance on homosexuality or women's rights and things like that. I remember some of you out there may have seen it. It's a good documentary to watch whether you're a believer or a non-believer. It's called Collision, and it's a documentary that records the relationship between Christopher Hitchens and Pastor Douglas Wilson, and also a debate that they engaged in together. And it's funny because the two of them couldn't be more diametrically opposed as far as their views on religion were concerned. And it's hard to believe that they're actually friends when you saw how, for lack of a better word, rabid their clashes could be. But supposedly they were friends. They formed a kind of friendship via email, and they even collaborated on a book together. But I remember during a debate, Christopher Hitchens brought up his argument about the slaughter of the Amalekites and how it shows or illustrates the sometimes barbaric or immoral nature of the Old Testament, or the tone that you sometimes find in the Old Testament. And Douglas Wilson tried to say to Christopher Hitchens, moral outrage regarding the slaughter of the Amalekites was wrong-headed, and that both he and Christopher would agree that the destruction of the Amalekites was a good thing because it's all right to destroy your enemies, kind of similar to how Christopher Hitchens actually supported the war in Iraq and how he had a very strong stance against terrorism, or kind of a very hawkish attitude when it came to the war on terror. And I think, I can't remember how Christopher handled that kind of counterattack from Wilson, but I actually thought it was kind of a childish attempt on Douglas Wilson's part, and I thought he left out one very key element of the story of the slaughter of the Amalekites. Sure, there's a lot of us out there, even like most decent people who are opposed to war, still recognize that sometimes, unfortunately, in this world, we do have to resort to military action in order to defend ourselves or in retaliation for some atrocity or something like that. But most of us are morally outraged by war crimes and wartime atrocities, especially against women and children. And in the Bible, I think what offends people's moral sensibilities so much about the stories of the destruction of the Amalekites or the Midianites is this attitude of slaughtering, almost everything that lives, the animals, the infants, women who have lain with men, but saving the young virgins for yourself as spoils of war. And if that's something Douglas Wilson sees as acceptable, then it would make me question his morality, and I actually think he's better than that. But I think when he tried to dismantle Christopher's point about the slaughter of the Amalekites, he left out that key issue. Yes, some of us might begrudgingly admit that sometimes military action is necessary, but most of us draw a line at committing atrocities against children and women. If we jump forward to the Middle Ages, we can find many hackneyed but valid examples of negative acts associated with religion. Of course, the Crusades, the Inquisition, witch hunts, paid indulgences, pogroms, and other forms of persecution of European Jews. If we move to our own times, there's things like the long drawn-out religious wars and conflicts, the bloody decades of war between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, violent clashes between Sunni and Shia Muslims, the persecution of Muslims such as in Bosnia and elsewhere. Then there's the negative impact on the welfare of children, the pre-sex abuse cover-ups in the Catholic Church, the marrying off of underage girls to grown men, as in the case with some fundamentalist Mormon sects, such as that of Warren Jeffs. The sexual abuse of children is also rampant in the disturbing cult known as the Children of God. And while we're on the subject of cults, there's the Jonestown Massacre, the Heaven's Gate suicides, the Aum Shinrikyo subway poisonings in Japan, and myriad other cases of abuse and manipulation at the hands of charismatic madmen. In general, it would seem that handing over your will to another human being never really ends well. I almost forgot about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, a drawn-out bloody attack on an immigrant wagon train by Mormons in the 19th century. While discussing modern ills associated with religion, we of course can't forget the modern scourge of fundamentalist Islamic terrorism, including the grisly, nightmarish atrocity, the heartbreaking, world-changing event that was 9/11. I should interrupt this litany of modern religious evils by saying I know it's not as simple as saying religion did it. I know that in many so-called religious conflicts, there's a political dimension or some kind of tribalistic struggle over territory, such as in the case of the conflict in Ireland or the conflict between Israel and Palestine. It would seem, though, that religion often acts as an accelerant. It probably would not be as easy to get someone to don a suicide vest or steer a speeding jet into the side of a skyscraper without the promise of some religious reward. We're social animals, but we're also tribal animals. I'm sure we would continue waging war on our fellow man to some degree, even without religion, but certainly religion plays its part. Before we end this list of quote-unquote religious evils, I'd like to add one more thing, something I have personal experience with, and it's the psychological toll that religion can take on an individual. I remember growing up Catholic and having instilled in me this ominous cosmology, this idea that two cosmic forces, the God and the devil, were constantly vying for my soul. A judgmental God that saw everything you did, and a devil that was constantly trying to lead you astray, with the possible consequence of eternal damnation hanging over my head like a sword of Damocles. And then perhaps even worse, if that's possible, is the horrible terror and emptiness you feel when your reason starts to kick in and despairingly you begin to realize that everything you've been taught, religiously at least, the idea that there's a creator, the immortality of the soul, that there is some great cosmic plan, that this may all simply be a man-made fairy tale. Now that I've beaten up on religion, what about atheism? Is there any truth to the claim made by some religious types that atheism is responsible for even more modern horror and atrocity than religion? Well, I'll start by tackling the claims that are more easily debunked. I agree with Christopher Hitchens in regard to the cases of North Korea and Nazi Germany. Christian apologists seem to like to erroneously point to them as examples of atheist regimes. In the case of North Korea, although the population and state are largely irreligious, North Korea's constitution does at least technically allow for the freedom of religion, and although Christians have not fared particularly well, Buddhists have even enjoyed a modest financial backing from the state to help promote their religion, probably a nod to the Buddhist role in the shaping of Korean culture. We also can't forget North Korea's cult of personality, a type of godlike worship of the dare leader Kim Jong-il, and even more so of his late father. The late Kim Jong-il's son doesn't seem to garner the same level of sincere worship and devotion as of yet. In the case of Nazi Germany, the claim that it's an example of an atheist regime is absurd. Although the Nazis did have a sick obsession with eugenics and so-called racial purity, and harbored an overall inhumanly cold survival of the fittest mentality, it was also a regime steeped in Teutonic neo-pagan symbolism. It was also a regime, despite its initial hostility towards Catholics, that adopted a kind of hijacked form of Christianity which they promoted as an antidote for what they saw as Jewish materialism. Surely it would have been much harder for the Nazis to get away with their institutionalized persecution of the Jewish people if they hadn't benefited from centuries-old foundation of medieval European anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitism based in part on the warped idea that the Jewish people were responsible for the death of the Christian Savior. Anti-Semitism, especially among Christians, has never made much sense to me. Jesus himself was Jewish, as were his disciples and the masses he preached to. The first quote-unquote Christians were Jewish, those followers of what scholars refer to as the Jesus movement that spread a budding Christianity still seen as a form of Judaism to the Gentiles of the Hellenistic world. But anyway, I know I'm digressing. The Nazis benefited from the work of crank theologians such as Ernst Bergman, who claimed that Jesus wasn't Jewish but was actually of Aryan ancestry and that Hitler was the new Messiah, warped claims which spit in the face of reason and established history. The case of Stalinist Russia is a bit more challenging. Although raised in an orthodox religious home, Stalin was undoubtedly, like Lenin, an atheist. Both men lived by the Marxist axiom that religion is the opium of the people, or popularly the opiate of the masses. They thought that opiate needed to be taken away in order to awaken a truly productive society. Stalin systematically promoted atheism and cruelly persecuted the religious. Churches were razed and tens of thousands of male and female clergy were persecuted and killed. Although the exact numbers are a matter of contention, up to 45 million people died under the reign of the Marxist Chinese leader Mao Zedong. But is atheism really to blame for the death tolls of communist leaders like Stalin and Chairman Mao? It's always been my assertion that atheism isn't a religion, but rather the absence of religion. Other than a dedication to empirical truth and scientific and scientific inquiry, I don't really think there's really any atheist dogma or any hard and fast rules or tenets one is expected to adhere to. Atheism, or unbelief, for me at least, ideally, isn't about being the member of some club or organization. It's a state of mind resulting from reason-based inquiry and a healthy scientific skepticism. For me, the evils of communist or atheist regimes are more the result of warped power-hungry minds and groupthink than they are the result of a lack of belief in God. There's also the adoption of the survival of the fittest mentality by cruel political regimes and even Wall Street big shots that needs to be addressed. Natural selection may be a fact of nature, but that doesn't mean we need to be social Darwinists. In fact, even Richard Dawkins, a renowned evolutionary biologist and atheist, is quick to draw a distinction between natural selection and social Darwinism. We may be the products of evolution, but evolution has wired us, at least in part, to be social animals with a capacity for compassion and empathy. In a sense, you could argue that's actually counter to our nature to be social Darwinists. Natural selection is heartless, but the creatures it shapes do not have to be. I suppose in the end, both atheism and religion are ideas, and ideas can always be used for good or evil. They are tools, the use of which depends on the wielder. I promised I would discuss whether or not religion had any redeeming value. In some cases, I think it does. Say in the case of the magnified emphasis on compassion for living beings that we find among Buddhists or Jains, or at least a partial impetus to help feed and clothe the less fortunate or take part in the community. One could argue that although religion can be a divisive force, it can also be a kind of social glue. That being said, I think it's also the case that religion can sometimes poison altruistic acts. Say in the case of Mother Teresa, she undoubtedly did a lot of good and selfless work for the poor and suffering, but her strict religious beliefs also led her to condemn contraception in an already overpopulated and disease-ridden environment. Then there's the case of missionaries. Giving aid to indigenous peoples while trying to get them to swap out their own established cultural beliefs for Christianity. And of course, it should be added that you don't need to be religious in order to take part in the community and do good works. What about religion's ability to offer an individual sense of self-transcendence? As I've said before, religion does not have a monopoly on transcendence. All of us humans are prone to moments of inspiration, altered consciousness, feelings of self-transcendence or oneness, feeling moved, as Christopher Hitchens used to say, by art and landscape. So in a sense, I suppose I end where I began, feeling that religion isn't necessarily or entirely responsible for social ills or tribalistic behavior, but that is nevertheless man-made. And that's it for this week. So as always, thank you for listening to The Week in Doubt. You can like The Week in Doubt Facebook page. You can like the episodes on YouTube. You can subscribe or rate the show through iTunes or Podbean. All right, thank you.